Joining me this morning are my colleagues Rachel Crossley, who is one of our senior consultants in the growth team, and also James Alexander, who has been working with our sort of AIM and small cap and growth clients for a very long time. I won't give his age away, but and he'll also be sharing some thoughts with us as well. So just wanted to start really by saying it's been quite a year in 2020 for annual reports. It's been quite a year, full stop, I think we would all agree. And I think we'd really recognise that the world is changing, and that's having an impact on what companies are having to report on. Pressure is growing on companies to demonstrate their broader contribution to society. There's a focus on long-term sustainable success is greater than ever. I think it's been the first year that companies have reported under Section 172. But then you add to that the challenges of COVID dominating the reporting stories, and the challenges around just reporting on that, particularly for December year ends. I think one consistency that remains that I've heard throughout this year is, I think, how can we reduce the number of pages is still probably the most common stated request that we hear from clients, and they're hearing from their boards as well. So yes, the annual report continues to grow. So without further ado, I want to hand over to Rachel just to take you through what we've seen as we've looked back on how companies have been reporting through the AIM 100. Over to you, Rach.
Great, thanks Jenny, and good morning everyone. Yes, as Jenny said, we conducted research from December year end 2019 AIM 100 reports that came out in the first half of the year, looking at those trends that Jenny's just mentioned around reporting, and how companies were responding to those and incorporating that into their reporting and broader communications. Everything, as you would expect, was reports reflecting the impact of COVID-19. But in addition to that, we did see more discussion around vision, purpose, culture and values, growing stakeholder engagement, better and much more disclosure on ESG issues, progress in governance reporting, and more communication across channels, so reusing assets from the annual report. So to go into those in a bit more detail, firstly, COVID-19. Not a surprise, I guess, that COVID-19 was mentioned in all of the reports, although despite them being December year ends, and when we did our first 25 FTSE 350 research, we found that most, but not all, mentioned it. I think AIM companies generally publish slightly later, so they had more opportunity. So yes, all addressed it somewhere, and generally not in one section, but included in multiple places around the report, which is as recommended by the FRC and indeed the audit community. COVID was a key section for the risk report for most companies. 77% covered it in risks. Chairman statements and CEO statements as well, a lot of information. And governance to some extent as well, some case studies and how the boards responded. So risk reporting as a key part of that is a key area of focus, and we expect that to continue to evolve, especially reporting on emerging risks, and COVID is part of that, or indeed the principal risks. So a couple of examples from the research to share. The one on the left, Alliance Pharma, they talked about COVID in their risks, incorporated it indeed also in their principal risk table under a broader heading of pandemics. And then on the right, Strix had an engaging case study on their response to COVID, the impacts, and particularly around employees, communities, and their broader stakeholders. So what do we think going forward for this year's reporting? This is obviously moving very fast, and what was relevant to talk about 3 months ago is moved on now, but we expect it to still be an area of focus for reporting. It will be a shift from the immediate response to the next phase, moving forward, and signs of recovery. So our tips for this year's reporting, discuss how you're moving forward as a company, prospects, challenges for the future and how you're dealing with those, and plans that you've put in place to ensure the longer term viability of the business, coming back to that point on long-term sustainable success. So moving on to another theme for the year, purpose and culture and values. There's been much greater emphasis on purpose and culture in reporting, and reflects the requirements in the new UK Corporate Governance Code and also the QCA code, as well as the strategic report. So this year we found that to be a relatively weak area of reporting for AIM companies. And indeed, I think reflecting some confusion around reporting on purpose and these different terms, purpose, vision, mission, what do they all mean? So just over half did include a vision statement, a broader aspirational statement. 21 included a purpose statement that they identified as a purpose statement on why do they exist beyond short-term financial success. And as you can see in this quote from Larry Fink, increasingly investors are thinking that that's a key to the success of the company. So there was more discussion of culture and values in reporting, but many companies struggled to articulate in a meaningful way what this meant and how this helped a company to differentiate itself. Particularly important for smaller companies, which often have a really strong sense of purpose and culture and values, and it's a key differentiator. A couple of examples. Amos Group sets out very clearly up front their purpose statement, enabling better care through technology innovation, and then weaves that throughout the sections of their report to show how they're looking to achieve that through their strategy and business model. And then on the right, SMS talks about the cultural values in the business model and has a separate spread setting out what that means and how those are being embedded across the company. So what would be our recommendations? Think about the broader purpose, why the company exists, and articulate this at the start of the report and ensure that it is interwoven throughout the report, making sure it's aligned with your culture, strategy, values, and how this all ties together. And then explain how your culture and values serve as a differentiator. Bring out examples. For example, if it's a culture of innovation, can you bring out some examples of that during the year, or a safety culture, and how that's been shown in your performance and how it drives the performance of the business. So moving on to our third area, another big topic for the year, the stakeholder agenda. And I'm sure you've all been thinking about your broader stakeholders, most of the ones set out here, particularly employees, customers and suppliers. We've had people talking about more, and of course, in addition to investors. So there's been growing legislative changes, new requirements, particularly on this front, the expanded Section 172 statement, which requires companies to report on how the directors are performing for the long-term sustainable success of the business, and therefore incorporate stakeholder engagement as part of that, and how that's taken into account by the company. So we found that most companies are reporting 68% on how they engage with their stakeholders, and some, about a fifth, include a dedicated spread on stakeholder engagement during the year, what's been discussed and any outcomes. That was the better reports, more context, issues discussed, outcomes, and also the other key part is how the board takes stakeholders' views into account in its decision making. We saw about a fifth this year talking about specific examples of that, and that's an area we would expect to see more of going forward. This was obviously the first year, so companies are just starting to find their way in this reporting. So a couple of examples here of companies that Advanced Medical Solutions had some good engaging spreads around stakeholders and how they engaged. And then on the right, SMS talking about principled decisions there. and how stakeholders were taken into account. So, for example, in an acquisition or in a strategic decision made, and how did they decide and consider their views. Our recommendations going forward. Yes, do use case studies or examples. So reporting we found this year was quite functional, reflecting the requirements, but there is a real opportunity to bring out some examples of how stakeholder engagement, your relationships with your stakeholders, contribute to long-term success, and to make those more engaging. On the section 172 statement, expand the statement. It's not just about engagement, but talk about actions for the company and outcomes from the engagement and what matters to your stakeholders. And then thirdly, include specific examples of board level decisions made during the year, and how stakeholders' views, employees, customers, suppliers were considered in those decisions. Doesn't have to be lengthy, but helps provide a good insight. So moving on to the other big theme of the year, ESG, and I'm sure that you've all been thinking about this issue. This is being driven by growing stakeholder and indeed investor demand for information around these issues. Looking at the stat there, 82% of the investment community now consider ESG factors when making their investment decisions. And indeed, I was at the IR Society virtual conference the other day, and all the sessions from fund managers, mainstream and specific, we're talking about how they incorporate ESG into their decision making. And we found that was reflected in the reports. So most STEM companies now reported on ESG issues, and 70% indeed included a separate sustainability, responsible business section of some description. But the quality of that reporting varied widely. Most companies did include an overview of activities and policies during the year relating to people, communities, and in some cases the environment. But only 21% identified the material sustainability issues, so what really mattered to them as a company. And there was limited information on performance metrics or data to back up that information that they provided, and obviously that's a key area that investors and others are looking for. Reporting on environmental performance, GHG emissions, climate change related disclosures was also weaker. 24% did report on their GHG emissions, and that hasn't been a requirement for AIM companies to date. So that was a good starting point, but there's more coming down the line. New requirements, SECR and TCFD, Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosures, where companies will be expected to report more on climate change, the risks and opportunities it presents and how they're looking at that. So I think that's an area of focus going forward. A couple of examples here. Jadestone Energy Fund had an engaging ESG section. So doesn't have to be text heavy, some stats and examples, case studies, and to bring out what they wanted to get across, their story for the year. And then Central Asia Metals had conducted a materiality analysis and clearly identified the material issues for them as a business and reported against those. So going forward, what do we expect to see? Yeah, companies should really look at this area, evolving their activities and associated reporting to meet the requirements. And you know, it's about long-term reputation and long-term sustainable success. So thinking about those issues when you're reporting. Absolutely key, and what the investors were talking about the other day is they do want companies to identify what's material, what's important to you as a business, and report against those issues and provide an insight into those issues rather than the broader range. include performance metrics, forward-looking objectives and progress during the year. And then further down the line for most companies, look at integrating issues of strategic importance, health and safety, employee retention, whatever that might be, into your reporting and across more broadly, rather than keeping it just in a separate section. So, and the final section on the findings of our research, governance. So 2 years ago, AIM companies were required to report against recognised governance code, and we have seen an improvement in reporting over the past 2 years. 85% report against the QCA code, but as a whole, reporting is quite generic and boilerplate, not much company-specific information. Some companies do provide more insight. About 15% outline their board activities during the year, focus areas, and the same number report on stakeholder engagement at a board level. But a lot of governance reports are quite text-heavy. About a fifth include charts, graphs, diagrams, to make the content more accessible and engaging. And I think for us, that's a big area of possible improvements going forward. Again, a couple of examples. Bringing out, so an engaging board of directors spread on the right from Madrid, bringing out skills and experience rather than in reams of text, and using some charts and graphs as well to show that. And on the left, central Asian methods, bringing out the skills through a skills matrix, and some case studies around stakeholder engagement as well in the governance section. So what are our recommendations in this area? We'll provide a more company-specific insight. So what has the board actually focused on during the year? And what are its key concerns and issues that have been discussed? Include a section here on board level engagement with stakeholders, so to the point on section 172 and how it relates to the board. And it might be around workforce engagement, particularly. And then make the report more engaging and accessible. There's a real opportunity here, as companies do with the strategic report, to include infographics, charts, diagrams, just to break up the text and make sure that it's easily accessible for the reader, as well as possibly some governance case studies of key achievements during the year.
Thanks, Rachel. That was great. So just from that, we wanted to just really have a look and I guess reflect on the annual report. And actually a question we come up against quite a lot is actually it's this thing we have to produce. It's a bit of a necessary evil process that companies have to go through every year. Is it just that, or actually can it be a really valuable communication tool? So I just want to hand over to James just to share some thoughts on this.
Brilliant, thanks Rachel and Jenny. I mean, the kind of big question is how do you balance all of the kind of ever increasing compliance and regulations and information that Rachel's just kind of spoken about, whilst keeping the annual report from growing into a kind of a massive encyclopedia and kind of maximizing the kind of the value from it. And it's not something that can be underestimated in its importance. So as you can see from this slide and some of the quotes here, it really is a kind of document of importance and a kind of a place that investors and stakeholders go to really get an understanding and a clear kind of coherent picture of your business and its performance. I mean, it isn't in a way a kind of, it's a shop window for a better expression, and it's an absolute direct reflection of your business and management teams. So getting it right and making sure it resonates with your audience is absolutely essential. Rachel, just go on to the next slide, please. So, with MiFID II, I'm sure you're all aware the extra pressures that are kind of put on yourselves in kind of reporting, having to engage with your investors, and how you really kind of stand out with less support from kind of banks and analysts. And as you know, AIM, it's a very crowded marketplace, over 1,000 listed companies on the exchange. So getting noticed isn't easy. And I always recommend it's important to really understand what your audiences are looking for in your report. Do they really get your business? I mean, you get your business, but do your investors really understand what you're trying to say? You know, what do they ask you at investor days? Do you think your share price is reflective of the performance? I often hear, you know, I have a lot of conversations with clients saying, you know, our share price is not reflective of our performance. And that to me kind of, we kind of talk through that, is about a perception gap about how investors see you and how you're actually operating. Is there something that concerns them? You know, and how do you stack up? So with all the hard work and effort it takes to produce an annual report, how do you really stand out from the crowd and, importantly, maximize the value of it? Next slide, please, Rachel. So it's very much about making sure that the narrative, the content, the messaging, as what we're calling here the verbal, is as concise and relevant as possible, and really supported by compelling designs to bring that to life, to make sure you're absolutely telling a coherent story as best you can. And don't forget, all this good content and messaging should flow consistently across your other communication channels. So I'm just going to kind of give some examples on really how we see the verbal side of kind of reporting working. On to the next one, please, Rachel. So make sure that each section really connects with each other. I mean, you've heard from Rachel, there's lots of areas of the annual report that you need to consider and think about, but make sure they're not siloed, and the kind of the story of those is a kind of connection through. So can we just go back one, please? Not just a consistent tone of voice, but, you know, does the strategy, does the performance, does the business model, are they all aligned? Do they all kind of talk through the same language each other, and not disconnected? And in this example from Hotel Chocolat, you know, their kind of connection is all around doing the right thing. And as you read through the narrative, this thread comes across and all sections are tied around kind of doing the right thing. Next one, please. And then make sure you kind of interweave non-financial issues in reporting, and matrix in your report. You know, whether these are just around health and safety, whether they're contract wins, whether they're staff retention. You know, think about what's really relevant for your business and what's really important for you as a business, and how do these kind of non-financial metrics really generate value for your stakeholders just beyond the kind of financial performance. And you'll see from this example, for Central Asia Metals, they really pick out what is material to them in a non-financial way, such as, you know, the health and safety. Obviously, they're a mining company, so health and safety around operational efficiency and around sustainability. And my last point, as Rachel's already sort of touched upon, is really how you use your purpose. And I think, you know, it's very much now around using your purpose to tie your whole report together. Use it to set the theme of your report and make sure that the kind of content cascades and flows from this in a very connected way. You'll see from Alliance Pharma, I mean, their purpose is very much around making a difference to people's lives by making a range of valuable healthcare products. And through the report, they really explain how they do make a difference to people's lives and a valuable range of healthcare products, and how they do this kind of globally. So throughout the report, they're kind of leveraging this and touching upon it and kind of explaining how they do it. Next slide. Jenny.
Lovely, thanks, James. So as James says, actually getting that narrative right, thinking about the messages and how that weaves through the report is really, really key. But actually, the time that goes into actually getting that right, if it's not presented well, I think we're really missing an opportunity. And at Emperor, we talk a lot about the 33-30 rule. And this is basically just a consideration really of how different audiences will read the annual report. And so you'll have majority, unfortunately, will probably spend sort of 30 seconds on a page as they sort of flick through. And so how you present your story needs to really come through for those that are just going to flick through the report. Then you'll have others that will spend a little bit more time, maybe 3 minutes, where they'll have more time to read the narrative. And then finally you get the unusuals, the people that will actually read it cover to cover and will spend kind of a full 30 minutes on the report. So you get this range of different readers accessing your annual report. So thinking about how you don't just have that brilliant narrative just buried in text, and actually bring that to life in a way that people are going to connect with it is really, really important. So if we can just go to the next page, Rachel. So one of the first things I'd say is in many ways less is more. We talk a lot about how the annual report is growing and the number of pages are increasing. And sometimes there can be real pressure to write reams and reams of text, when actually having a really good infographics, charts, and for example, an at-a-glance spread that really gets across the kind of key statistics around your business, and is really, really key. And so I think thinking about how you can reduce blocks of narrative to actually show something that is much more in summary form. So I've got an example here from Gear 4 Music. You can see there they've got a really simple at-a-glance spread, which kind of covers their revenue split. It's got some key stats in there. It covers their brands. And then they've also got a really nice, concise investment case, which again I think is a brilliant thing to kind of bring out in your annual report. In many ways, the whole of your annual report is a bit like your investment case, but actually to pull that out and state that really clearly. And then that can be also used as a sort of navigation to other bits of the report. And what you'll also see with this is just the play on language. Our product range is hitting all the right notes. The way that actually the theme of the business is also brought out in the sort of in the headlines through the report. And if we click to the next one, I think this again is just a really, really, really good opportunity to use imagery and strong headlines to really bring out those stories and themes. So this is Codemasters' annual report, and unsurprisingly, from the sort of imagery here, they create the games, the F1 racing games. So really exciting, dynamic company. And I love the fact that the title of their annual report is driven by ambition, but then actually that's kind of carried right the way through the report. 2020 was no different. We've only just started. You've got the kind of performance map there, racing ahead, plenty of fuel in the tank. So you've got this story that's coming through, even if you're not reading the detail of the pages. I'm also a massive fan of a really good infographic. And again, particularly in areas of the report like the business model, where you can take that information, take complex information and actually present it in infographic format, it becomes much easier for the reader to digest. And also it becomes a really useful tool. You can take that and use it on your website. You can use it in your presentations. So thinking again about, as you go through the report, what information can be presented differently, and actually using design to really, really support that. And also just in terms of bringing frameworks to life and thinking about how you present strategy. I always think your strategy is very much the heart of the report. What's the plan? How are you going to continue to grow? And so actually showing those kind of clear strategic priorities, progress made for the year, priorities for the next year, and also opportunities to kind of link that to KPIs and risks, but showing that in a really nice format that you can again use elsewhere and potentially connect to case studies where you can expand and give context to progress. So again, another really just thinking about how you present things just makes all that information so much more easy to digest and to find. And I also think, I mean, Rachel touched on this, that you know, governance reporting is beginning to evolve. We've seen this kind of happen at probably a slower pace than we've seen within the AIM reports than we've seen sort of across the FTSE 350, but it's definitely beginning to sort of change from dry boilerplate disclosures to being much more engaging and much more thought around actually how you present that. And this is a nice example from Hotel Chocolat, where they bring information out with charts and graphs. They've got a really nice table, navigation table, where it goes through the code's principles of the QCA code and actually references where to find it. So again, even within your governance section, I think thinking about how you can bring that to life is really important, because we know this is actually being it's under so much more scrutiny these days. So it's not a middle section of the report that's kind of ignored. This is something that is being looked at. So anything we can do to make that information more accessible is only going to be a good thing. And finally, and for those of you that I've met before, you will hear me banging on about this a lot because it's something I believe really passionately in. I think all the time and effort that goes into producing your annual report, to just leave it merely in the printed document or the PDF online, is just missing a trick. Thinking about how you can take all that really good content and cascade it across your channels, in your presentations, across your website, and also on social media. There's so many opportunities to use that content elsewhere. And also just thinking about how you use those other channels. It's quite interesting when we sort of reviewed the AIM 100 reports, there are very few that produce an online annual report, an online summary. And it will be interesting, as we've seen the kind of FTSE 350 shift to much more emphasis on that, whether we'll see that follow across AIM reporting as well. But even if you're not having a dedicated online report, I think taking content and really embedding it across your website, so that on the IR section of your website, it's really easy to look at your business model, to look at your strategy, to see your investment case, and to see that real consistency with what you're saying in the annual report. I think the opportunity to use video, animation is really exciting. We did a piece of work with Hotel Chocolat where we used assets from the annual report to produce a sort of 90-second summary that they used at the start of their Capital Markets Day. And it was interactive, it talked about showed some of the highlights, and it was just a really engaging way of taking that content and using it elsewhere. I think there's opportunities to do something like that for employees. So again, it's just using all that time and that good content and getting that cascaded across your different channels. I think if we can just go on to the next one, Rachel, I think fundamentally what I'm talking about is the opportunity of joining up the dots across your stakeholder communications. So looking at what those key objectives are, what those key messages are you want to communicate, what that corporate narrative is, thinking about those different stakeholder groups, and considering all the channels you've got to use, but then also mapping that across your whole corporate calendar and thinking beyond just the annual report, all those other key touch points and events that are happening during the year across your different stakeholder groups, and thinking about how you make use and you actually communicate that story with real clarity and consistency. So to summarise, before we just open the floor to some questions, I think what we'd really stress is don't see your annual report as just a compliance-led document. I think there's an opportunity to do so much more to make it a useful tool. See it as that opportunity to really tell a clear and cohesive story. And also take advantage, using design to really make the information accessible and the content really engaging, so that your readers are going to engage with it. Think about the different audiences, the different ways that people read the report, but also the people beyond shareholders and investors who are going to be looking at your annual report, the employees, potential customers. There's a whole range of different stakeholder groups that are accessing it. But also, in conclusion, just really taking that broader approach and incorporating all of your communication channels with how you're getting that story and that narrative across. So thank you all very much for listening patiently. If you do have any questions, do feel free to get in touch with either Rachel, myself, or James. Massive thank you to you all for joining us, and we hope it's been helpful, and we look forward to speaking to you all again soon.